My daughter's DNA test for a school project revealed my husband has been lying about which child is biologically his. The DNA test kit arrived on a Monday afternoon in October, packaged in bright blue plastic with cartoon helixes printed on the side. My daughter Lily brought it to the kitchen table where I was sorting through bills and announced that her 8th grade science class was doing a genetics project. Everyone had to test themselves and their parents to create family trees showing hereditary traits. She was excited, chattering about dominant and recessive genes, about how Mr. Holloway said they'd discover fascinating patterns in their ancestry. I signed the permission form without reading it carefully, distracted by the credit card statement showing charges I didn't recognize. My husband Colin had been spending money again without discussing it, and I was mentally preparing for another conversation about our finances. Lily swabbed her cheek, sealed it in the provided tube, and asked when I'd do mine. I told her that evening after dinner, and she reminded me we'd need Colin's too. He was traveling for work, due back Thursday. She carefully labeled her sample tube with her name and ID number, then set the kit aside with mine and Colin's forms paper clipped together. I remember thinking how organized she was, how responsible, how proud I was that she took school seriously. I didn't know that small kit would detonate our family like a bomb. Colin came home Thursday night carrying his usual rolling suitcase and the exhaustion he always wore after business trips. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, traveling 3 weeks per month to hospitals and clinics across the region. He'd been doing it for 12 years, since before Lily was born, and the routine had worn grooves into our marriage. I'd learned to manage the house alone, to be both parents when he was gone, to accept his absence as the price of his salary. We needed the money, especially with Lily starting to think about college and our son Ryan's therapy bills piling up. Ryan was 6 and had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder 2 years earlier. The therapies weren't covered by insurance, and we were paying $3,000 a month out of pocket for services that were slowly helping him develop language and social skills. Colin kissed me absently when he walked in, asked what was for dinner, and went upstairs to shower without asking about my week. This was normal. This was our marriage. I'd stopped expecting more years ago. Lily ambushed him after dinner with the DNA kit, explaining the project with the same enthusiasm she'd shown me. Colin's face did something strange when she mentioned DNA testing, a flicker of something I couldn't identify before he smiled and said, "Sure, he'd do it." I was clearing plates and only half watching, but later I'd remember that moment, that microsecond of hesitation. He swabbed his cheek while Lily supervised, making sure he collected enough cells, then sealed his sample and added it to the envelope with mine and hers. She promised to mail it the next morning on her way to school. The lab would process everything and send results directly to the school within 3 weeks, analyzed by the curriculum company partnering with the science department. It was all very organized, very educational, very innocuous. Colin asked Lily about her other classes, and she chattered about algebra and social studies, while Ryan played with his tablet in the corner, making the happy humming sounds he made when content. We looked like a normal family. We looked like people who knew each other. 3 weeks passed in the usual chaos of work and school and therapy appointments. I worked as a nurse at Riverside Hospital, 12-hour shifts in the cardiac unit, and my schedule meant I was often asleep when Colin was awake and vice versa. We communicated through texts and notes on the refrigerator, ships passing in the night, and I told myself this was temporary, that when the kids were older we'd reconnect, that all marriages went through phases like this. Ryan's therapist said he was making remarkable progress, using 2- and 3-word phrases now, making eye contact more consistently. This felt like victory, like maybe the sacrifices were worth it. Lily was thriving in school, getting straight A's, talking about becoming a doctor like she'd been saying since she was 5. Colin was traveling even more than usual, gone 4 weeks straight in November, and I was annoyed but not suspicious. He'd always traveled. This was our life. I had no reason to question it until the evening Lily came home crying. She walked through the front door after school with tears streaming down her face and her backpack hanging from one shoulder like she'd forgotten she was wearing it. I was in the kitchen making Ryan's dinner, something soft he'd actually eat, and I dropped the spoon when I saw her expression. I asked what happened, who hurt her, was she okay? She couldn't speak at first, just thrust a folder at me with shaking hands. Inside was a packet of papers from her genetics project, Mr. Holloway's explanations of genetic inheritance patterns, and 3 DNA analysis reports printed on official letterhead from the testing company. I looked at the results without understanding at first. Lily's report showed her genetic markers. Mine showed mine. Colin's showed his. And then there was a comparison chart showing parent-child relationships, percentage of shared DNA, probability of biological relationship. The numbers didn't make sense. I read them 3 times before my brain accepted what they were saying. According to the analysis, Colin and Lily shared 50% of their DNA. Father and daughter, confirmed biological relationship with 99.9% certainty. I felt relief for half a second before reading the next line. I shared 0 significant genetic markers with Lily, beyond what would be expected from any random woman of European descent. The report stated clearly that I was not Lily's biological mother. Probability of maternal relationship, 0.02%. The numbers were stark, undeniable, impossible. I'd carried Lily for 9 months. I'd felt her move inside me. I'd labored for 14 hours to bring her into the world. I had stretch marks and a C-section scar to prove it. This had to be a mistake, a lab error, contaminated samples. But Lily was looking at me with devastation in her eyes, and she said in a broken voice, "Mr. Holloway pulled me aside after class. He said there was probably a mistake and I shouldn't worry, but, Mom, the numbers don't lie. He showed me how to read them. You're not my biological mother." I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the papers sliding from my hands onto the table. Ryan was still playing in the living room, oblivious to the earthquake happening in the next room. My mind was racing through possibilities, through explanations that could make this make sense. Hospital mix-up at birth? But I'd never left Lily alone in the hospital, never let her out of my sight except for a few minutes during tests. And those mix-ups were babies getting swapped, not babies being given to the wrong mother when the right mother was present. IVF? But we'd never done fertility treatments. I'd gotten pregnant naturally. Immediately, the first month we'd tried. I remembered the positive test, remembered Colin's joy, remembered every doctor's appointment and ultrasound. Surrogacy? But I'd carried her myself. I had the medical records, the photos of my pregnant belly, the memory of her birth burned into my nervous system. Nothing made sense. Nothing except the impossible thought that kept trying to surface, the thought I kept pushing down because it was too monstrous to consider. Lily was still crying, asking me what this meant, asking if I was really her mother. I pulled her into my arms and held her tight, feeling her body shake with sobs. I told her of course I was her mother, that I'd raised her, that biology didn't define motherhood, that this was some kind of mistake we'd figure out. But even as I said the words, I was thinking about Colin's reaction when she'd first mentioned the DNA test. That flicker of something in his expression, that hesitation before he'd agreed. Had he known? Had he known this would happen and let it happen anyway? Why would he do that? What possible reason could he have? I told Lily to go upstairs and try to calm down, that I'd figure this out, that everything would be okay. She went, still crying, and I heard her bedroom door close. Then I called Colin. He answered after 4 rings, sounding distracted. I could hear airport sounds in the background, announcements and rolling luggage and echoing voices. I asked where he was and he said Atlanta, waiting for a flight home. I told him we needed to talk immediately, that something had happened with Lily's school project. There was a pause, longer than necessary, and then he asked what kind of something. I said the DNA test results came back and there was a problem. Another pause. I could hear him breathing. Then he said he'd be home in 4 hours and we'd talk then. I said no, we'd talk now, and I asked him directly. "Colin, is Lily my biological daughter?" He was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then he said in a voice I didn't recognize, "We'll talk when I get home. Don't do anything until I get there. Please, Rachel." He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the kitchen holding my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He hadn't denied it. He hadn't said, "Of course she is. Don't be ridiculous." He'd said, "We'll talk when I get there," which meant there was something to talk about, which meant he knew. He'd known all along. I looked at the DNA report again, forcing myself to understand what it was telling me. Lily was Colin's biological daughter, but not mine. There was only one way that could happen. Colin had another woman somewhere, a woman he'd gotten pregnant, a woman who'd carried and delivered Lily. And then somehow, impossibly, I'd ended up raising that child while believing she was mine. How was that possible? How could I have been pregnant and given birth and been wrong about the baby being mine? Unless I hadn't been pregnant? Unless everything I remembered about carrying Lily was false. But that was insane. I had memories, detailed memories, of morning sickness and ultrasounds and feeling her kick. I went upstairs to our bedroom and opened Colin's filing cabinet where he kept important documents. I found my medical records from Lily's pregnancy and birth, pulled them out with shaking hands, and read through them carefully. Everything looked normal. Prenatal appointments starting at 8 weeks, ultrasounds at 12 and 20 weeks, regular checkups, labor and delivery notes from Riverside Hospital where I worked. Dr. Kensington had been my OB, and I remembered her clearly. Remembered her telling me to push. Remembered her placing Lily on my chest afterward. These were real memories, weren't they? I wasn't crazy, but the DNA didn't lie. Lily wasn't biologically mine. I called Dr. Kensington's office, but she'd retired 3 years ago. The receptionist gave me the name of the doctor who'd taken over her practice, but that didn't help me. I needed Dr. Kensington herself, needed to ask her what had really happened 13 years ago in that delivery room. I found her home number through a nurse I knew who'd worked with her for years. I called even though it was 8 at night, beyond inappropriate hours, and she answered sounding surprised to hear from me. I apologized for calling so late and then asked her to tell me about Lily's birth. Dr. Kensington was quiet for a moment, then asked why I was asking. I told her about the DNA test, about the results that said Lily wasn't mine. She made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sigh, and said, "Oh, Rachel, I'd hoped you'd never find out." The words hit me like a physical blow. I asked what she meant, and she said she couldn't discuss it over the phone, that if I wanted the truth, I needed to come see her in person. I said I'd be there in 20 minutes. She lived in a retirement community on the north side of town, and I drove there in a daze, barely remembering to text my neighbor to watch Ryan for an hour. Dr. Kensington met me at her door looking older than I remembered, her hair completely white now, her face lined with age and what looked like guilt. She led me to her living room and gestured for me to sit on her couch. Then she sat across from me and folded her hands in her lap and said, "What I'm about to tell you, I did because I thought I was helping. I thought I was giving you what you wanted more than anything. But I've carried the guilt for 13 years, and I'm almost relieved it's finally coming out." She took a breath. "You were never pregnant with Lily, Rachel. You had a hysterical pregnancy, a pseudocyesis. It's rare but real. Your body mimicked all the symptoms of pregnancy because you wanted a baby so desperately. Your belly swelled, you had morning sickness, you even felt movement that you interpreted as the baby kicking. But there was no baby. The ultrasounds you remember seeing showed someone else's pregnancy, not yours." I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. That wasn't possible. I remembered being pregnant. I remembered everything. Dr. Kensington continued in that same calm, clinical voice. "Colin came to me privately when you were 4 months into the false pregnancy. He was desperate, terrified of what would happen when you went into labor and there was no baby. He'd been having an affair, Rachel. A woman named Victoria. She was pregnant with his child, due the same month your false pregnancy was supposed to end. He begged me to help him figure out a way to handle the situation that wouldn't destroy you. I knew hysterical pregnancies could cause complete psychological breaks when the truth was revealed. Women who experienced them sometimes became suicidal when they realized there was no baby. Colin was worried you'd hurt yourself." She paused. "So, I suggested a solution. Victoria would give birth, and we'd tell you that you'd given birth. You'd wake up from labor believing the baby was yours, and Colin could end the affair and you'd never have to know." Victoria agreed because she didn't want the baby. She wanted to give it up for adoption anyway. I couldn't breathe. The room was tilting. Dr. Kensington kept talking, explaining how they'd done it, how she'd arranged for me to be heavily sedated during what I thought was labor, how Victoria had given birth in a different room at the same time, how they'd brought Lily to me afterward and told me she was mine, how she'd falsified the medical records to show I'd delivered, how Colin had paid Victoria to disappear and sign away her rights, how they'd all conspired to make me believe I'd given birth to a baby that wasn't biologically mine. "I thought I was helping," Dr. Kensington said again. "I thought it was better than you suffering the psychological trauma of losing a pregnancy that was never real. But I was wrong. What I did was unethical, illegal, and I've regretted it every day since." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm so sorry." I stood up and walked out without saying anything, got in my car and drove home on autopilot. My mind was blank, overwhelmed, unable to process the enormity of what I'd just learned. 13 years of my life had been built on a lie. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my history, about my own body and experience was false. I hadn't given birth to Lily. Some other woman had. Some woman Colin had been sleeping with while pretending everything was fine with our marriage. And he'd conspired with my own doctor to make me believe I'd carried and delivered a baby that wasn't mine. The violation was so profound I couldn't even locate where to begin feeling it. I was numb, shut down, operating on some automatic level while my conscious mind screamed in the background. Colin's car was in the driveway when I got home. He was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for me, still in his business clothes, his expression carefully neutral. I walked past him without speaking, went to the liquor cabinet and poured myself a glass of whiskey, drank it in one swallow and poured another. Then I turned to face him and said, "I just talked to Dr. Kensington. She told me everything." His face went gray. He stood up, started to move toward me, but I held up my hand and he stopped. "Don't," I said. "Don't come near me. Don't touch me. Just tell me why. Tell me why you did this to me." Colin sat back down heavily. He looked like he might vomit. Then he started talking, his voice low and unsteady, telling me the story from his perspective. He'd met Victoria at a medical conference 5 years into our marriage. They'd had an affair that lasted 3 months before he'd ended it, but she'd gotten pregnant. And when she told him, he'd panicked. He'd wanted to tell me, wanted to confess everything, but then I'd announced I was pregnant too. Except I wasn't actually pregnant. He'd figured it out after a few weeks when certain things didn't add up, when I described symptoms that seemed exaggerated, when my belly grew faster than it should have. He'd researched hysterical pregnancy and realized that's what was happening to me. He'd been trying to figure out how to tell me when Victoria contacted him saying she was definitely pregnant and due in March, the same month I thought I was due. "I was terrified," Colin said. "Terrified of what would happen when you went into labor and there was no baby. Dr. Kensington said women in your state could have complete breaks from reality, could hurt themselves or others. I didn't know what to do. And Victoria didn't want the baby. She was going to give it up for adoption. So when Dr. Kensington suggested we could make it work, that we could give you a baby and avoid the trauma of you discovering the pregnancy was false, I agreed. I listened to him explain how they'd planned it, how they'd coordinated the births, how they'd sedated me and brought me Lily and told me she was mine, how Victoria had signed papers giving up all rights, had taken a payment from Colin, and had disappeared back to wherever she'd come from, how Dr. Kensington had falsified records to make it look like I'd delivered, how everyone had agreed it was better for me to never know. "I did it for you," Colin said. "I know how it sounds, but I did it because I loved you and couldn't stand the thought of you suffering that kind of psychological trauma. You wanted a baby so desperately, Rachel. You would have been destroyed if you'd found out you weren't really pregnant. This way you got to be a mother, got to raise Lily, and avoided the pain. He looked at me with desperate eyes. I know I should have told you years ago. I know I should have been honest, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine explaining it. And you were so happy. You loved being Lily's mother. How could I take that away from you? I stared at him and felt something inside me crystallize into cold fury. You didn't do this for me, I said. You did this for you. You had an affair, got another woman pregnant, and found a way to avoid the consequences by tricking your wife into raising your illegitimate child. You turned me into a surrogate for your mistress without my knowledge or consent. You violated my body, my mind, my entire reality. And you had the arrogance to think you were doing me a favor. Colin was shaking his head, saying no, it wasn't like that. But I wasn't finished. You watched me bond with that baby believing she was mine. You watched me develop stretch marks and go through postpartum depression and struggle with breastfeeding, and you never once told me the truth. You let me believe my body had done something it hadn't done. You let me build my entire identity as a mother on a foundation of lies. My voice was rising, and I didn't care. What about Ryan? Is he mine? Or did you pull the same trick twice? Colin's eyes widened. Ryan is yours. Biologically yours. I swear. You were actually pregnant with Ryan. That was real. I felt a small measure of relief, but it was overwhelmed by everything else. At least Ryan was mine. At least one of my children was actually mine. But that raised another question. If I could get pregnant with Ryan, why couldn't I get pregnant with Lily? Why did I have a hysterical pregnancy the first time? Colin looked away. You were pregnant, he said quietly. You were actually pregnant when you made the announcement, but you miscarried at 10 weeks. You didn't know it happened. It was a silent miscarriage. By the time you would have gone in for your 12-week ultrasound, there wouldn't have been a heartbeat. But your body didn't recognize the loss, didn't expel the tissue. You kept experiencing pregnancy symptoms because hormonally, you still thought you were pregnant. Dr. Kensington was going to tell you at the ultrasound, but then Victoria contacted me with her own pregnancy news, and things spiraled from there. So I had been pregnant. I had conceived. And then I'd lost the baby, and no one had told me. They'd let me continue thinking I was pregnant, let my body continue the charade, and then they'd substituted someone else's baby for the one I'd lost. The cruelty of it was staggering. I'd grieved for Lily when she was a teenager acting distant, had worried I was failing as a mother, had compared myself to other mothers and found myself wanting. And all along, she wasn't even mine. Not biologically, not in the way that supposedly mattered according to the DNA test she'd brought home from school. I looked at Colin and realized I didn't know him at all. 13 years of marriage after Lily's birth, and I'd been married to a stranger. A man capable of orchestrating an elaborate deception, of manipulating my reality, of treating me like a prop in his morality play. I told Colin to leave. He tried to argue, tried to say we needed to talk more, figure out what to tell Lily, plan how to handle this. I said no, he needed to leave the house immediately, or I'd call the police and report what he and Dr. Kensington had done. He went pale and said it wasn't illegal. It had been a private arrangement. There was nothing to report. I laughed, a harsh sound without humor. You falsified medical records. You committed fraud. You had me sign documents saying I'd given birth when I hadn't. That's forgery, Colin. That's criminal. And Dr. Kensington could lose her medical license retroactively if this came out. So you're going to leave, and you're going to stay away while I figure out what to do next. He left. I watched him pack a bag and walk out to his car, and then I locked the door behind him and checked on the kids. Ryan was asleep. Lily was in her room, door closed. I knocked softly and she told me to come in. She was sitting on her bed, her eyes red from crying, the genetics folder on her desk. I sat beside her and took her hand. Lily, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear, but I need you to know that I love you more than anything in the world, and that will never change no matter what. She looked at me with frightened eyes. I told her the truth, a simplified version without all the ugly details about the affair and the deception. I told her that I'd thought I was pregnant with her, but it had been a medical condition that mimicked pregnancy, that her biological mother was a woman named Victoria who'd given her to us at birth, that I'd raised her from the moment she was born, that I was her mother in every way that mattered, but that biologically she'd come from someone else. Your dad and the doctor thought they were protecting me by not telling me, I said. They thought it would be too painful to know the truth, but they should have been honest. You deserve to know who you are, and I deserve to know the truth about my own body and my own life. Lily was crying again, but quietly now. She asked if I was going to stop being her mother. I pulled her into my arms and held her tight. Never, I said. You're my daughter. I've loved you since the moment they put you in my arms. Biology doesn't change that. Family isn't just DNA, Lily. It's love and commitment and showing up every day. I've been your mother for 13 years, and I'll be your mother for the rest of our lives. She cried into my shoulder, and I cried too, both of us grieving the loss of the simple truth we'd thought we had. Eventually, she fell asleep curled against me, and I stayed there holding her, protecting her from the chaos I knew was coming, because this wasn't over. This was just beginning. The next morning, I called a lawyer. His name was Marcus Ashford, and he specialized in family law and fraud cases. I told him everything, sent him copies of the DNA test and the medical records, and he listened with increasing disbelief. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Brennan, what was done to you constitutes medical fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and possibly medical malpractice. Dr. Kensington could face criminal charges and civil liability. Your husband could face fraud charges. This is one of the most egregious cases I've encountered. We need to move quickly to protect your rights, especially regarding custody of both children." I asked what he meant about custody. Marcus explained that legally, because Lily wasn't my biological child and I'd never formally adopted her, Colin could argue I had no legal standing as her parent. If we divorced, he could potentially claim sole custody based on biological relationship, unless we could prove fraud and get the court to recognize my parental rights based on being deceived. I felt panic rising. Could Colin really take Lily from me? After everything he'd done, could he use his own deception as a weapon to separate me from my daughter? Marcus said it was complicated. Normally, a woman who gives birth is presumed to be the legal mother regardless of genetics. But in this case, I hadn't given birth, Victoria had, and Victoria had signed away her rights to Colin, not to me. The legal paperwork established Colin as Lily's sole parent. I'd never been on the birth certificate as the birth mother because I hadn't been the birth mother, even though I'd thought I was. The records showed Victoria as the mother who'd surrendered her rights, and Colin as the father who'd retained his. I was legally nobody to Lily, a woman who'd raised someone else's child under false pretenses. "We need to act fast," Marcus said. "I'll file for emergency custody based on your role as Lily's psychological parent and the fraud perpetrated against you. But you need to understand, this is going to be ugly. Colin will fight back. Dr. Kensington will deny everything unless we can force her to testify. And Lily will be caught in the middle of a legal battle that will expose everything about her origins." I said I didn't care how ugly it got. I wasn't losing my daughter. Marcus started drafting papers immediately. He filed for divorce, emergency custody of both children, and a civil suit against Colin for fraud. He also contacted the medical board about Dr. Kensington's actions, triggering an investigation. Within 48 hours, Colin had been served with divorce papers and a restraining order preventing him from taking the children out of state. He hired his own attorney, an aggressive woman named Donna Pritchard, who specialized in defending men in custody battles. The war had begun. Colin's strategy became clear quickly. His attorney argued that I'd known about the arrangement, that I'd been complicit in the deception, that I couldn't now claim fraud when I'd benefited from receiving a child I'd wanted. They claimed I'd been mentally unstable, that the hysterical pregnancy was evidence of psychological problems that made me unfit to parent. They claimed Dr. Kensington had acted in my best interest with my implied consent. Marcus countered with Dr. Kensington herself. He'd gotten her to agree to testify in exchange for immunity from criminal prosecution. She gave a deposition describing exactly how the deception had been planned and executed, confirming that I'd never known the truth, that I'd been sedated and deceived. Her testimony was damning for Colin, but Donna Pritchard attacked her credibility, pointed out she was testifying to save herself from prosecution, suggested she was lying to shift blame onto Colin. The case became a media sensation. Local news picked it up first, then regional, then national. "Woman learns she didn't give birth to daughter she raised for 13 years," was the headline that followed me everywhere. Reporters called constantly. Neighbors whispered. Lily's school became a nightmare of stares and questions. I pulled her out and started homeschooling her, trying to create some bubble of normalcy while everything collapsed around us. Ryan's therapist said the stress was affecting his progress. He'd started regressing, becoming more withdrawn, sensing the chaos even if he couldn't articulate it. The custody hearing was scheduled for January, 3 months after Lily's DNA test had revealed the truth. Those 3 months were the worst of my life. Colin was allowed supervised visitation with the kids, but Lily refused to see him. She was furious at him, felt betrayed, couldn't understand why he'd lied to her for her entire life. Ryan didn't understand what was happening, but he'd cry when Colin picked him up for visits, clinging to me. I spent thousands on legal fees, burning through our savings, taking out loans against the house. Colin fought every motion, challenged every filing, tried to paint me as unstable and vindictive. He'd moved in with his parents and was working on a narrative where he'd been a devoted father trying to protect his mentally ill wife, and now that wife was punishing him for his kindness. His parents believed him, or pretended to. They'd never liked me anyway. Had always thought Colin had married beneath him when he chose a nurse instead of another doctor or lawyer. The hearing itself was brutal. Donna Pritchard cross-examined me aggressively, trying to break me down, suggesting I'd known about Victoria all along and was fabricating the story about being deceived. She brought in a psychiatrist who'd reviewed my medical records and testified that hysterical pregnancy often occurred in women with personality disorders, suggesting I was mentally unstable. Marcus fought back with my own expert witnesses, with Dr. Kensington's testimony, with evidence of Colin's affair and the elaborate conspiracy to deceive me. But the judge was old-fashioned, skeptical of what he called exotic medical explanations, and clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. He kept asking why I hadn't known I wasn't really pregnant, why I hadn't questioned the doctors, why I'd been so easily fooled. The implication was that I must have been willfully ignorant, must have suspected something and chosen not to investigate. Lily testified, which broke my heart. She was only 13, but the judge allowed it because she was old enough to express a preference about custody. She sat in the witness box looking small and scared, and told the judge she wanted to stay with me, that I was her mother, the only mother she'd ever known, that she didn't want to live with Colin because he'd lied to her about something fundamental. She said, "He let me believe something about myself that wasn't true. He let me think my mom gave birth to me when she didn't. How can I trust anything he says after that?" Donna Pritchard tried to undermine her testimony, suggested she'd been coached, suggested she was too young to understand the complexity of the situation, but Lily held firm, her voice shaking but steady, and I saw the judge's expression soften slightly as he watched her. Maybe he wasn't completely immune to the human element of this disaster. The judge took 2 weeks to issue his ruling. When it came, it was mixed. He granted me primary custody of Ryan, acknowledging that I was his biological and legal mother without question. But Lily's situation was more complicated. The judge ruled that while I'd clearly been deceived and had acted as Lily's mother in good faith, the legal reality was that I had no biological or adoptive relationship to her. Colin was her sole legal parent. However, given Lily's stated preference and the extraordinary circumstances of the case, he was granting me custody of Lily as well, but only if Colin agreed not to contest it. If Colin fought for sole custody, the judge would have to rule in Colin's favor based on legal precedent, because I had no standing as a parent. It was a compromise that felt like extortion. The judge was essentially forcing Colin to choose between fighting for his legal rights and accepting a custody arrangement that kept the family intact. Colin's attorney advised him to fight, said he'd win, that he could get sole custody of Lily, and I'd have no recourse. But Colin hesitated. Maybe he saw the damage it would do to Lily, or maybe he realized that winning custody wouldn't win him his daughter's love. After a week of deliberation, he agreed to the judge's terms. He signed paperwork acknowledging my parental rights to Lily despite the lack of biological connection, agreed to joint custody with me having primary placement, agreed to allow me to formally adopt Lily so I'd have legal standing going forward. In exchange, I agreed to drop the fraud lawsuit and not pursue criminal charges. It felt like letting him off easy, like he was escaping the consequences of what he'd done. But I agreed because keeping Lily was more important than punishing Colin. Marcus said we'd gotten the best outcome we could hope for given the legal complications. That didn't make it feel like justice. The adoption process took another 6 months. I had to go through home studies and background checks and interviews, had to prove I was fit to parent a child I'd been parenting for 13 years. Victoria had to be located and contacted to sign paperwork terminating her parental rights officially, which opened a whole new nightmare. She was living in Seattle, remarried with 3 kids of her own, and wanted nothing to do with Lily or the chaos. She signed the papers and sent them back without comment. Lily asked if she wanted to meet her biological mother, and I said it was her choice. She thought about it for days, then said no. "She's just a stranger who shares my DNA," Lily said. "You're my mom. That's all I need to know." The finalization hearing happened in July, more than 9 months after the DNA test had destroyed our world. The judge signed the papers making me legally Lily's mother through adoption, and I cried with relief. She was mine now, not just emotionally, but legally. Colin couldn't take her from me. We'd survived, but survival came with costs. Colin and I were divorced, our marriage irreparably broken. I'd lost any trust or affection I'd had for him, and he'd become someone I barely recognized. A stranger who'd lied to me for 13 years, who'd manipulated my reality, who'd put his own convenience above my right to truth. He saw the kids every other weekend per the custody agreement, but his relationship with Lily was damaged beyond repair. She was cordial, but distant, treated him like an obligation rather than a father. Ryan was too young to understand the full story, but he'd picked up on the tension and was wary around Colin in ways he hadn't been before. Colin tried to rebuild, to apologize, to explain that he'd thought he was doing the right thing, but some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Dr. Kensington's medical license was suspended pending investigation. She ultimately retired rather than face a formal hearing, and I heard she'd moved out of state to live with her daughter. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall. She'd been trying to help in her misguided way, and she'd paid a price for her mistake. The hardest part was explaining everything to extended family and friends, people who'd known me through my pregnancy with Lily, who'd thrown me baby showers and visited me in the hospital, who'd watched me struggle with what I'd thought was postpartum depression. I had to tell them it had all been a lie, that I'd never actually given birth, that my entire experience had been fabricated. Some people were supportive, understanding, others were skeptical, suggested I must have known something was wrong, implied I was either lying or foolish. Those relationships ended. I learned who my real friends were. My parents were devastated, both by the deception and by the fact that Lily wasn't their biological granddaughter. It took them time to process, but eventually they came around to accepting that love mattered more than genetics. Ryan's autism diagnosis had already taught them that family meant showing up regardless of circumstances. They continued treating Lily exactly as they always had, and she never knew they'd struggled with the revelation. Lily struggled the most. She'd gone from being a confident, happy kid to someone anxious and uncertain about her identity. She started therapy with a psychologist who specialized in adoption issues. working through her feelings about being raised by a mother who wasn't biologically hers, about having a biological mother who'd given her up, about her father's massive deception. She'd ask me questions I couldn't always answer. Did Victoria ever think about her? Why had Colin thought lying was better than telling the truth? If I hadn't been pregnant, what had I felt moving inside me during those months? That last question haunted me. I'd felt movement. Had been certain it was the baby kicking. The therapist explained that women experiencing pseudocyesis could feel their own intestinal movements and interpret them as fetal movement, especially if they desperately wanted to be pregnant. My brain had reinterpreted normal bodily functions as pregnancy symptoms because I'd wanted so badly to believe I was carrying a child. The power of the mind to deceive itself was terrifying. 2 years after the DNA test, life had found a new normal. Lily was 15, thriving despite everything, talking about college and her future with renewed confidence. She'd decided she wanted to be a genetic counselor, helping other people understand their DNA and family histories. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Ryan was 8, making remarkable progress with his therapies, talking in full sentences now, even cracking jokes. He had no memory of the chaos of those early months, for which I was grateful. Colin remained a peripheral figure in our lives, someone we saw regularly but who'd never regained the central position he'd once held. He'd started dating someone new, a woman without children or complicated history, and seemed to be building a simpler life. I'd started dating too, a doctor from the hospital who knew my whole story and accepted it without judgment. We were taking things slowly, both of us carrying scars from previous relationships, but there was possibility there, hope for something real built on honesty rather than deception. I thought about Victoria sometimes, wondered if she ever regretted giving up Lily, if she ever thought about the daughter she'd carried and surrendered. I imagined her seeing news stories about our case and realizing her decision had created this mess, but mostly I felt nothing toward her. She'd been a footnote in Colin's affair. A woman who'd gotten pregnant and made a choice. The real betrayal had been Colin's and Dr. Kensington's and the system that had allowed them to deceive me so completely. On Lily's 16th birthday, we had a small party at home. She blew out candles on a cake I'd made, surrounded by friends who knew nothing about the DNA test that had revealed our family's secrets, and for a moment everything felt normal. Afterward, when everyone had left, she came to find me in the kitchen where I was cleaning up. She hugged me tight and said, "Thanks, Mom, for fighting for me, for not giving up even when it was hard. You're the best mother I could have asked for." I held her, my daughter who wasn't my daughter by biology but was mine in every way that mattered, and felt peace. We'd survived. We'd rebuilt. And we'd learned that family was something you chose and fought for, not something determined by genetics alone. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.